So after running this line, we can see that we have two rows of data, breaking it down by class. So one way to add additional variables is through ggplot with the aesthetics. However, another way you can add variables is through facets, and they're a useful tool to split categorical variables continuous, and that way you can have subplots. So in this tutorial, we're going to be using facet wrap, and if you haven't installed any packages yet, you want to install the tidyverse and then load it with the library function. So do this before you do anything else. Moving forward then, we're going to use facet wrap to facet by a single variable following this formula, which is you use the tilde followed by a variable name. And that's more or less indicating how you were going to wrap and by what variable. So for example, if we use the MPG dataset, which is already existing in R, so you do not need to download it or install it. We're going to use ggplot. Your data is MPG. And as a reminder, MPG looks at the manufacturer of cars, the model of cars, the amount of liters that it can displace in said cars, the year it was made, the amount of cylinders, the transmission, what style of drivetrain it has, and the mileage for city and highway, and its particular class. If you want to understand what these variables mean, you do question mark MPG. It pops up in the bottom right hand panel, and you can scroll through to see what each variable means as well. City miles per gallon, highway miles per gallon, fuel type and class. We just went through that up here, but that's another way you can look at what's inside the data set ahead of time. So ggplot, data is MPG. We're going to do a scatter plot, geom point, with the aesthetic of the x-axis showing the displacement in liters and the y-axis showing the mileage for highways. Okay, so now we're going to facet wrap because we want to add another variable. We're going to facet wrap by class. So it's going to create a grid, n row equals 2. So n row stands for number of rows. If you wanted it in columns, you could do n col, and that'd be the number of columns. So after running this line, we can see that we have two rows of data, breaking it down by class, and we're looking at the engine displacement in liters on the X and the MPG on the highway on the Y. So you can see for all the points of two-seaters, compacts, midsize, and so on, you can see the distribution of their amount of displacement in liters and how much mileage it gets per gallon. And what we can see tends to be lower MPG and higher amount of engine displacement in two-seaters. You have a good range in subcompacts, but you can see there's a negative correlation between engine displacement and MPG. So as you have more displacement in liters, you have lower miles per gallon. And that seems to be the overall trend that you see lightly scattered through each class of car. So this was a way you could break it down by class and wrap your data. So now you have multiple plots within one singular plot. And this is a really powerful example and tool to use so you can show multiple areas of data, isolate certain pockets of your data, and have it all in one concise location. Maybe look at a facet grid. What if you want to add two variables to your facet? Well, you need to use facet grid. You can only do one with facet wrap. Facet grid will compound and show you two variables. So same ggplot as before, data MPG, geom point, engine displacement by highway mileage, facet grid. We're going to do drive, which is the type of drivetrain, by cylinders. So how many cylinders are in the car. And we can see this becomes more complex. You have two y variables more or less, and you have two x variables more or less. This top one is the number of cylinders, 4, 5, 6, and 8 cylinder vehicles. The bottom axis is engine displacement in liters. The left y-axis is highway mileage per gallon, and the right y shows the drivetrain. So four-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, or rear-wheel drive. As you may notice, there are some grids that are blank. Why might that be? Well, there just might not be any four-wheel drive vehicles with 5 cylinders or rear-wheel drive vehicles with 5 or 4 cylinders. They tend to be more cylinder vehicles with rear-wheel drive, and this further breaks down all of these compounding factors. So you just added another level of complexity to your figure, and you can isolate even more pockets of your data to display. Remember, this all has to be categorical. But what if we only want to look at the drivetrain and highway mileage? Well, then you do ggplot, geom point, engine displacement by highway, facet grid, you can still do a grid, drivetrain tilde period. So it's not going by cylinders anymore. It's going by just drivetrain alone in a grid fashion. Now, in a moment, I'll touch on what this period and tilde indicates, because we're going to touch on that momentarily. But as this stands, you can see now you're only looking at drivetrain, four-wheel, front wheel, rear wheel, engine displacement in liters, and miles per gallon. And you can see a really nice spread, and we have 3 rows. And you can really see the spread of your data and how four-wheel drive vehicles vary based on the amount of cylinders, I mean displacement, excuse me, as well as for each respective drivetrain. Removing a layer complexity, but maybe showing another aspect of your data very cleanly. Again, what if you didn't want to show drivetrain, but you wanted to show number of cylinders and highway mileage? You do roughly the same, except you reverse it. This whole ggplot line is the same. You facet grid, period, tilde by cylinders. And this might start to reveal what the period and tilde location in facet grid does. So as we can now see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns representing the 4 types of cylinders that vehicles in this data set have. Again, the y-axis is still highway mileage, and the x-axis is engine displacement in liters. You can see groupings of your data based on the cylinders. So faceting allows you to still have your X and Y aesthetic, but it groups in panels based on what you want to isolate. So in this instance, we're isolating cylinders. Previously, we isolated drivetrain, and you can look at what's in your data set so long as it is categorical, and you can isolate it similarly to what we're showing here. So does the dot tilde matter? Sort of. And this will come down to how you might want to portray your data. For instance, we're going to focus just on the same ggplot and only look at drivetrain. And we're going to change the location of the tilde period from before drivetrain or after drivetrain. We're going to run it twice. And as you can see, we have the second plot, so this second line, in columns versus the first one in rows. So the tilde period indicates that you want to look at drivetrain in a fashion of seeing it in rows versus columns that the second one shows. Now, in this instance, it might be wise of you to use the rows. You get a wider spread of your data points. It tells a more compelling story if that's what you're aiming to have, and it's easier on the eye to read based on the variables at hand. This still shows the same rough trends, but as you can see, things become grouped. It's a little bit harder for the eye to read, maybe not for four-wheel drive, but you get the point. Likewise for cylinders. Now, the row fashion doesn't necessarily work as well as the columns. The columns have a wide spread. The rows do as well, This one's a bit more of a toss-up, albeit this column version is a little bit easier on the eye. So if you're working with your own data, I would recommend trying both to kind of see how you prefer it to be visualized. Thank you for getting to this point in the video. This is a brief introduction on faceting your data. I hope it was useful. Consider liking this video, consider subscribing to the channel. If you have questions, leave them below, and we'll continue on in future videos with additional aspects of RStudio.